It's hard to pick the single scariest experience I've had camping because there have been a few that really got under my skin in different ways. But the one that sticks in my mind the most, probably because it blended fear, confusion, and just plain old unease in equal parts, was a trip I did years back with my wife, followed by another trip with my best friend, and a solo trip that ended with me rethinking where I pitch my shelter. They all sort of stitched themselves together into one long memory, and even now when I close my eyes, I can still feel the wind shaking the trees or smell the damp wood of that old, rotting outhouse. The first one, the one that really set the tone for how chaotic nature can be, was a few years ago in the middle of a jack pine forest in northern Ontario. My wife and I were trying to get away for a long weekend. We'd both been burned out from work. Life had been feeling heavy, and we just needed a break. We picked a campsite I'd used before, not maintained, but not truly backcountry either. You could get to it with a short hike about 800 meters from the car, and it was tucked far enough into the trees to feel isolated but close enough to get out quickly if needed. We set up camp in the late afternoon. It had been a clear day, cool and calm, the kind of weather you cross your fingers for when you're planning a trip. The jack pine forest was dense but not oppressive. The ground was soft with needles, and the trees creaked a little in the wind, but nothing that set off alarm bells. We had the tent set up, a small fire going, and were just finishing up dinner, some foil-wrapped sausages and potatoes, when the wind started picking up. First, it was just a few gusts, nothing unusual. Pine needles lifted and scattered, and the tops of the trees started to sway more aggressively. Within 15 minutes, the gusts turned into full-on wind blasts, the kind that make you stop what you're doing and listen. Then came the groaning. Long, deep creaks from the tall jack pines, like the forest was flexing and ready to snap. I've always had a healthy respect for trees, especially the kind that grow tall and spindly like jack pines. They're not the most solid when the wind gets bad. The trunks are thin and the branches are brittle, and if the roots are shallow, they'll fall. Simple as that. One loud crack snapped through the woods to our left, maybe 100 meters off, then another to our right, each one followed by a crash as a tree came down. We killed the fire quickly. I grabbed the hatchet and my folding saw and cut a small clear area around the tent, enough that if a nearby tree fell, we might be lucky enough to avoid being hit. It wasn't much, just a quick buffer, but it made us feel like we were doing something. We had nowhere else to go. The car was too far to run to in that wind, and trying to navigate a dense forest at dusk with trees falling around you is a good way to get yourself killed. So we stayed put. All night, the wind howled. Trees groaned and bent, and every so often one would fall. Some near, some far, but close enough that you felt the vibration in the ground. I didn't sleep. I lay on my back in the tent, holding my wife's hand and staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between gusts, flinching at every crack. The worst part was not knowing when it would end. You start to realize just how small and powerless you are when you're in a nylon tent surrounded by falling trees. The first light, the wind calmed. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, half expecting to see a mess of downed trees all around us. And there were a few, one not more than 30 feet away, snapped clean through the trunk. But the tent had somehow made it through untouched. We packed up fast. No breakfast, just folded the gear and walked fast and quiet through the pines. On the way back to the car, we passed 3 more trees that had fallen across the trail overnight. It shook me more than I expected. After that trip, I started being pickier about where I pitched a tent. No more setups under tall trees when heavy wind was in the forecast. I kept hearing those cracks in my head. The second story happened not long after. I went camping with my best friend, Greg. We'd found this semi-remote campsite up an old logging road that only a 4x4 could really handle. It wasn't backcountry, but it wasn't busy either. One of those in-between places. There were a couple of fire rings, 2 outhouses, and a few falling apart picnic tables. The kind of place that probably gets checked by a park ranger once or twice a year, if that. We got there mid-afternoon and started setting up. I was pitching the tent while Greg wandered off toward the outhouses to check them out. They were about 40 meters away from camp, tucked slightly downhill, and I saw him stop at the first one, open the door, stand there for a bit, then close it and walk to the second. He went in that one and came out a couple minutes later. I figured he had just picked the cleaner of the 2 and didn't think much about it. When he got back, he told me I should go look in the first one. At first I figured it was going to be something gross, like someone had missed the hole or some animal had gotten in and died. That's happened before. But it was weirder than that. I walked down, opened the door, and saw 3 full backpacks. Big packs. The kind you use for multi-day trips. Not the cheap ones either, these were quality. The first 2 were loaded with standard gear, sleeping bags, small cook kits, clothes, a stove, the usual stuff. Neatly packed, like someone had taken care of the gear. But the third? That one was different. It was stuffed full of Skittles. No exaggeration. Full to the top. Bulk bags. Small snack bags. Family-sized packs. Every flavor I've ever seen, and some I didn't even recognize. I pulled a few out just to make sure it wasn't some elaborate prank. But nope, Skittles. Probably 80 liters worth, all told. Just candy. No clothes, no gear. Just a massive stash of rainbow sugar. We didn't touch anything else. Just zipped the bags back up and left them where they were. It was unsettling, to say the least. Like walking into someone else's story halfway through, and the plot made no sense. We camped there for 4 nights, and not once did we see another person. No cars, no hikers, nothing. When we left, the bags were still sitting in that outhouse. We reported it when we got back to town. Told the conservation officers everything, where the campsite was, what we found, even described the packs. They wrote it all down, thanked us, and that was that. I never heard back. Still don't know who packed that 3rd bag or why. Maybe they were resupplying for a weird trip. Maybe it was a joke. But it didn't feel funny at the time. Felt like something was off. And when you're that far into the woods, even a little weird can feel very wrong. The last one happened on a solo trip with my dog, Buck. I wasn't deep in the woods. Just a spur-of-the-moment overnight trip off a gravel road I hadn't explored before. I found a flat spot maybe 400 meters in, put up a quick tarp shelter between 2 trees, and made a small fire. Nothing fancy. I wasn't planning on staying long. Just wanted to get away from everything for a bit. Buck curled up next to me, and I started drifting off. It was a quiet night. No wind, no animals making noise. Just the crackle of the fire and the occasional shift of branches. Then I heard the truck. It came in fast, tearing down the road somewhere behind me. Maybe 200 meters off, but close enough that I could hear the engine straining. Then came voices, loud, shouting, laughing, clearly drunk. Then the gunshots, 3 or 4 in a row. Then a pause, then more. I sat up fast, heart pounding. Buck was on alert too, ears forward, tail stiff. I knew I'd made a mistake. I had parked off one road and hiked in, not realizing there was a second road nearby that looped behind me. And now there were a bunch of guys out there drinking and shooting. Probably had no idea I was anywhere nearby. But based on the lay of the land and how close they were, I was pretty sure they were shooting in my direction. I didn't wait. I packed up quick, just the essentials. Tarp down, fire out, Buck on a short leash. No lights, just moved low and fast back toward the car, sticking to tree cover and listening for the engine. More shots rang out. My back was crawling. I couldn't shake the idea that a stray bullet could come sailing through the trees any second. I made it to the car without incident, got Buck inside, and drove out with my headlights off for the first kilometer. Once I hit the main road, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. Never went back to that spot again. All 3 of those trips rattled me in different ways. The windstorm showed me how vulnerable you are to nature when things turn, even with a well-made tent and a plan. The Skittles incident reminded me that people can be just as strange and unpredictable as anything in the wild. And the shooting? That one drilled it home. Being alone in the woods is peaceful, sure, but sometimes it puts you too close to people you don't want to be anywhere near. Now I double-check every map, keep my setups minimal, and pay attention to weather, access roads, and signs of other people. I still camp, still hike, but there's always a little voice in the back of my mind now, reminding me how quickly a quiet night can turn into something else. And I always check the outhouses, just in case. I went camping in Colorado once with 3 buddies from work. We all needed a break from the city and figured a long weekend out in the wild would do us good. We were all in decent shape and had done a few hikes together before, but this time we wanted to really disconnect. No phones, no GPS, just a topo map, compasses, and our packs. We planned on hiking deep into the forest and staying out for 3 nights. We parked our cars at a small trailhead just past a tiny mountain town, about 2 hours west of Denver. It was early fall, crisp in the mornings, but still warm enough during the day. We each had around 40 pounds on our backs, tents, sleeping bags, food, water filters, first aid kits, and basic survival gear. The plan was simple. Hike in about 10 miles, find a good flat spot to set up base camp, and then spend the next 2 days exploring before heading back. The first day went fine. We followed a well-worn trail up into the foothills, slowly gaining elevation. The trees were starting to change color, and the forest had that damp, earthy smell that always makes me feel at ease. We passed a few other hikers on the first few miles, but after about the 5th mile, we didn't see anyone else. That was what we wanted: space, quiet, and no distractions. By late afternoon, we were off trail, following a small game path up a narrow ridge. One of the guys had marked an area on the map that looked like it could be a good camping spot. A flat shelf just below a rocky outcrop with a small creek running nearby. When we got there, it didn't disappoint. The view stretched out across the valley, and the sound of running water was just close enough to hear, but not so close as to keep us up. We set up camp, tents in a loose semicircle, the fire ring a few feet out from the center. We boiled water, made dinner, and by the time the sun dipped behind the ridge, we were sitting around the fire sipping whiskey from a flask someone had brought along. It was quiet except for the occasional crack of the firewood and the distant chirp of some night insect. I slept hard that night. The next morning, we ate a quick breakfast and packed day packs with essentials: water, food, maps, emergency gear. The plan was to explore the area to the west of camp. There were no trails there, just raw forest. It was the kind of place where you really had to pay attention to your compass and landmarks. The terrain was uneven and scattered with thick pine groves, patches of deadfall, and long stretches of open meadow that had gone golden with the season. Around midday, we crested a small ridge and found a narrow animal trail that followed a dry gully. It didn't look like much, but it seemed to head down into a basin that none of us had marked. We figured we'd follow it down for a bit and see what was there. That's when we noticed something strange. The gully emptied into a clearing maybe 100 yards wide, and smack in the middle of it was a structure, a cabin. It looked like something out of an old photo. Hand-hewn logs, slanted roof, the windows either broken or just open squares without glass. The whole thing sagged a little to one side like it had been there a long time. But it wasn't just the cabin that felt off. There was a kind of invisible boundary around it. I don't know how else to describe it. About 50 feet out from the cabin in all directions, everything looked wrong. The grass was yellowed and patchy. The bushes were dried out and brittle. There were no birds chirping, no squirrels rustling through the leaves. It was dead quiet, and on the ground, scattered here and there, were small animal carcasses. Squirrels, birds, a few rabbits, all dried out. No signs of violence, no blood, just lying there intact but clearly dead for a while. I stopped walking. My first thought was poison. Maybe someone had dumped chemicals or used some kind of pesticide, but that didn't make sense out here in the middle of nowhere. We hadn't passed any signs of old mining or logging equipment. There were no tracks, no smell, no containers or barrels. Nothing that screamed contamination, just silence and death. We stood there for a while, maybe 5 minutes, taking it all in. The air felt still. Not heavy or foul-smelling, just still, like there was no wind at all. I remember the sun was out, but everything near the cabin looked slightly duller. Like the light just didn't bounce off the plants the way it should. I didn't step forward. None of us did. We all kept our distance, circling the edge of that strange patch of dead ground without saying a word. We didn't need to. Every one of us could feel it. Something wasn't right. On the north side of the cabin, I noticed something even weirder. A tree, maybe a spruce or pine, had fallen. The trunk ended right at the edge of the cabin's dead zone. The half inside the circle was gray and brittle, the bark peeling off in large, dry flakes. The other half, outside the circle, was healthy, green moss still clinging to the bark. We stared at it like it was a magic trick. But it wasn't magic. It was real. Something had done that. One of the guys slowly took out his phone to take a picture, but he didn't step any closer. I remember him shaking his head, putting the phone back, and just saying later that it felt wrong to take photos. Eventually, we pulled back from the clearing and followed the same trail out, heading uphill to get some distance between us and that place. None of us wanted to sit down for lunch near it. We hiked for another hour in silence before we finally found a shaded patch near a stream and took a break. Later that evening, back at camp, we finally talked about it. The dead animals, the strange discoloration, the total silence. But none of us had any solid theories. We weren't chemists or forest rangers. We just knew what we saw, and it stuck with us. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about how wide that dead zone had been and what would have happened if we had gone inside. What if we'd stayed there too long? Would we have gotten sick? Would we have ended up like the animals, lying quietly in the grass with no visible wounds? The next morning, we packed up and hiked back to the cars. The whole trip had changed tone after that. The trees didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt like they were watching us, waiting. A few weeks later, I started researching the area. I looked at old mining maps, reports of chemical dumping, anything that might explain what we'd seen. I found nothing. That region had never been developed, never logged or mined. No EPA warnings, no hazmat incidents, no government records of any kind. I even contacted a forestry professor at a nearby university and described the area in vague terms, leaving out the location, just asking about natural causes of vegetation death in circular patterns. He listed a few things: soil fungus, underground gas leaks, radiation from old military testing. But he admitted that none of those would explain the clean, perfect circle and the fact that even small mobile animals had died within it. We never went back. I still have the topo map with that clearing circled in red ink. Sometimes I look at it and think about how close we came to stepping inside. I think about the moment I almost put a foot forward and caught myself. Whatever killed the plants and animals around that cabin didn't make a sound. It didn't leave a mess. It just stopped life, quietly, efficiently. There are places in the woods that still hold secrets. That was one of them, and I'm glad we didn't go further. That line in the dirt, that invisible ring, it was enough, and we listened. I drove out early that morning, long before the sun came up. The plan was to get a full day of hiking in before settling at a backcountry site I'd picked from the park's map. It wasn't a designated campground, but it was far enough from any trail to give me that full isolation I'd been needing. Life had been noisy lately. Between work and people and the general buzz of screens, I just wanted to be away from all of it for a few nights. No service, no voices, no demands. The trailhead sat quiet under a pale sky when I arrived. I parked, locked up, adjusted the straps on my pack, and set out. The terrain was rougher than I remembered from the map, dry and rocky with long stretches of sun-blasted dust between clusters of scrub and cactus. I'd chosen this desert canyon range for its silence and difficulty. Most casual hikers stayed in the lowlands or near the marked campsites. Out here, I'd be alone. I hiked for hours. The sun climbed hard, beating down on my neck and shoulders despite the long-sleeve shirt and hat. I drank steadily from my bladder hose, checking my GPS occasionally to make sure I was still on track. Around mid-afternoon, I came across a small dry wash that carved into the side of a bluff. That's where I stopped to rest, setting my pack against a boulder and sitting in the shade it cast. I chewed on some jerky and trail mix, stretching my legs, listening to the emptiness. When I moved again, I found a narrow ledge path that wrapped up and over a low ridge, and by early evening I'd found a spot that looked good enough to camp. It wasn't flat, not completely, but it was clear of vegetation and had a small outcrop that could shield me from the wind if it picked up. I dropped my pack and started setting up. Nothing fancy, just a lightweight one-person tent, a roll mat, and a small packable stove for heating water. As I unpacked and got organized, I kicked a few rocks aside to flatten the ground more. One of them looked like it had something wedged underneath, some kind of black piece of bark or plastic. I crouched down and brushed it with the back of my hand. It shifted slightly, and I leaned in to see better. That's when it moved. It wasn't bark. It wasn't plastic. It was a scorpion, a big one, nearly as long as my palm, dark brown with faint orange on its pincers. It wasn't just resting, it was curled tight in a defensive position, with its tail curved underneath it like it was trapped. I backed off fast, nearly tripping, and stared at it from a few feet away. The scorpion didn't move. I waited, heart pounding, watching for any twitch. Still nothing. Eventually, I circled around it at a safe distance and looked closer from a different angle. That's when I saw it. The stinger wasn't arched up and ready to strike like most scorpions I'd seen in pictures. It was twisted, almost bent sideways at the base. It looked damaged. Then it hit me. I might have stepped on it when I was clearing rocks. I hadn't felt anything, no sting, but it was possible I'd pinned it just right to bend its tail, maybe even dislocated the joint. That thing could have nailed me, and out here, miles from the nearest road, that would have been a serious problem. Real serious. Even non-lethal species can cause intense pain, swelling, vomiting. Just the kind of physical stress you don't want in a dry, remote canyon. And this thing had been inches from my hand when I brushed it. It was a close call. Too close. I used a long stick to gently nudge the scorpion away from camp. It scuttled awkwardly across the dirt, tail dragging, and eventually disappeared under a rock slab. That shook me more than I expected. I'd come out here to unplug, to relax, but now every little sound in the brush, every rustle of wind through dry leaves, made me twitch. I finished setting up camp and made dinner, just a bag of dehydrated pasta that I rehydrated with boiling water. I ate it slowly, my eyes scanning the edges of the fading light for more movement. That night, the desert cooled fast. I pulled on my jacket and zipped into my tent, lying on my back and staring up through the mesh at the stars. The sky was huge and sharp with light, and for a little while, I forgot about the scorpion. But sometime deep in the night, I woke up sweating and tense. I'd had a dream, something about bugs crawling on me, but it wasn't the dream that stuck. It was the feeling I'd had just before waking. That helplessness. That reminder that out here, you're never really safe. Not from the elements. Not from your own mistakes. Not from nature. In the morning, I moved camp. I packed up fast, not bothering with breakfast, and hiked another few miles up the canyon. I found a flatter spot near a cluster of boulders that offered both shade and a slight elevation. Better visibility, fewer low places for things to hide. Still, I couldn't shake that edge. The rest of the day passed in silence. I didn't hike much further, just explored the immediate area and kept my eyes low to the ground. Every stick looked like a tail. Every rock held the possibility of another scorpion or worse. I kept checking my boots before putting them on. I tapped the edges of my sleeping bag out before unrolling it. I used my headlamp obsessively at night, scanning the ground around my tent before stepping out to pee. On the third morning, I woke up with a deep ache in my lower back and hips. Sleeping on hard ground always does that to me, but this time it felt sharper. I stretched, moved around, boiled some water for coffee. That's when I noticed something else. My left boot was gone. Not far, just a few feet from where I'd left it, but definitely moved. I walked over and picked it up, turning it upside down and shaking it just in case. Nothing came out. Still, it felt wrong. Too deliberate. Hadn't just rolled. It looked placed. I checked the ground and saw some faint prints in the dust. Not animal. Not hoof or claw or pad. They looked human. Barefoot. Long toes, wide spacing. Could have been old. Could have been from me, though I doubted it. I spent the next hour double-checking my surroundings. Nothing else seemed disturbed. My food was sealed in a bear-proof canister, untouched. My pack was still zipped. My GPS showed the same coordinates as the day before. But I kept thinking about that boot. Was it wind? Unlikely. Something stronger? I didn't know. That afternoon, I considered cutting the trip short, but I didn't want to hike back down in the heat. I decided to stay one more night and leave first thing at dawn. That evening, I built a small fire in a rock ring someone else had made before me. I sat with my back to a boulder and kept the fire small, just enough for light. The temperature dropped again, and the air turned still. No wind, no sound, just the occasional crack of the fire and the dry scrape of something shifting in the brush. I didn't sleep much. Every snap of a twig outside made my body tense. I kept my knife near me. No bear spray out here, but I had a whistle, a headlamp, and enough adrenaline to stay alert. When morning came, I packed up before sunrise. I didn't bother eating or making coffee. I just wanted to move. The hike back was long and quiet. No signs of anyone. No sign of the scorpion. Just hours of rock and sand and heat. When I finally reached the trailhead, I felt a wave of relief I hadn't expected. The car was still there, untouched. I threw my pack in the back, slid into the driver's seat, and just sat there for a few minutes, staring out the windshield. Back home that night, I laid everything out in the garage. I inspected every item, shook out every pocket. When I got to my boots, I turned the left one over and found something tucked into the toe. It was a tiny scorpion, dead, dried up and stiff. I don't know how it got there. Maybe I missed it that morning in the canyon. Maybe it crawled in before I left and died on the hike out. Or maybe it was in there the night before and I just didn't feel it. Whatever the case, it brought everything back. The fear, the uncertainty, the sense that I dodged something not just once, but maybe twice. I threw the boot away. After that trip, I didn't go camping for a while. Not because of the scorpion, not exactly, but because it reminded me how thin the line is between control and chaos when you're out there alone. You think you're prepared. You think you're careful. But all it takes is one step. Just one step on something small and silent and dangerous, and everything changes. I still camp now, but I pick different spots. I stay closer to trails. I pack heavier, and I never, ever forget to check my boots. I had always loved the outdoors. My wife, however, wasn't as keen on it as I was. Still, she humored me when I suggested we go on a camping trip in the middle of nowhere, far from civilization. It would be just the two of us, a bit of quiet time and some fresh air. At least that was the plan. I thought I had picked a peaceful spot, a place where we could relax and get away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. We'd been driving for a while before we found the perfect spot. It was tucked deep into a forest, surrounded by towering trees, with a small clearing where we could set up our tent. The trees were mainly jack pine, their spindly trunks and long, slender needles giving the area a haunting, almost foreboding look. But that's exactly what I loved about it: the isolation, the quiet, and the raw beauty of nature. I had started setting up the tent when the wind began to pick up. It wasn't anything serious at first, just a slight breeze rustling through the pines. But as I dug the stakes into the ground, the wind began to howl. I could feel it picking up strength, bending the trees and making the air feel charged with energy. The sound of the wind was like a distant scream, whistling through the branches. My wife looked uneasy as she helped me set up the campfire. She wasn't used to this kind of wilderness, and I could tell she was starting to get nervous. The sky, which had been clear moments before, was now clouding over. It happened fast, like something had switched. The darkening sky sent a chill through the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. My wife didn't need to say anything. I could see it on her face. She was uncomfortable. I tried to reassure her, but the wind continued to roar, now violently shaking the trees. I camped in worse weather before, but this was different. It didn't feel like just a storm. It felt like the forest itself was alive, angry. The first tree fell in the distance with a loud crash. My wife jumped, her eyes wide in fear. I knew right away this wasn't a normal windstorm. The wind wasn't just blowing. It was tearing through the forest, and it was coming for us. I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the tent, trying to keep my own fear in check. The air felt thick with tension, and the sound of trees snapping and branches breaking echoed all around us. The wind was relentless. The trees groaned and creaked, and it was as if the entire forest was about to collapse on top of us. We had to move quickly. I started grabbing the supplies, stuffing them into the tent as fast as I could. But the wind was so strong it felt like it was trying to push us out of the clearing. I told my wife to get inside the tent and zip it up tight, and then I tried to secure the remaining gear. The sound of branches falling, sometimes close, sometimes far, was deafening. I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet as the storm raged on. I quickly set up the tarp on top of the tent, hoping it would provide some extra protection. It didn't seem like enough. The wind howled like a freight train, and I could hear the trees cracking, some of them splintering as they broke free from their roots and fell to the ground. The storm lasted for what felt like hours, though it was probably closer to half an hour. The sky darkened further, and I couldn't tell if it was the storm itself or something else that was making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The whole forest seemed to be alive, pulsing with energy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were no longer alone. I don't know why I felt that way, but the isolation, the violent storm, and the eerie silence that followed all added up to a sense of impending doom. Finally, the storm subsided. The wind dropped, and the forest became eerily still. It was as if the entire world had held its breath, waiting for the storm to pass. My wife, who had been silent for most of the ordeal, looked at me with wide eyes. Her face was pale, and I could tell she was just as shaken as I was. We stayed in the tent for the rest of the night, both of us too anxious to sleep. I kept checking the weather app on my phone, hoping to see some sign of a change, but it was useless. No weather system showed up. It was as if the storm had appeared out of nowhere, a force of nature that wasn't supposed to happen in this area. But what bothered me the most wasn't just the storm. It was that feeling of being watched, the sense that something was out there, waiting for us. We decided to pack up the next morning. The storm had passed, but the mood had shifted. Neither of us felt safe anymore. The wind had calmed down, and the sky had cleared, but the damage was evident. Trees were down everywhere, and branches lay scattered across the ground. The forest had been torn apart. We didn't speak much as we packed up the gear, both of us eager to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was an unnatural stillness to the place now, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. A few months later, I went camping with my best friend. We decided to head to a semi-remote camping area, a place that was usually accessible by car, but only with a 4x4. I wasn't exactly sure why we picked this spot, but something about it intrigued me. It was a neglected, semi-maintained area with a few fire pits, some weathered picnic tables, and a rundown outhouse. Parks checked the place once a year or so, but it was mostly forgotten by most people. That suited me fine. I didn't want to be around anyone else. When we got there, it was eerily quiet. We unpacked the truck and set up camp, and as we were getting ready to make dinner, my friend wandered off toward the outhouse. I didn't think anything of it, but then, a few minutes later, he came back, looking a little weird. "Go check out the first one," he said, pointing to the outhouse he had just walked out of. At first, I assumed someone had left a mess in there or that an animal had gotten stuck, something gross like that. But when I went over to check, I was shocked. The inside of the outhouse wasn't disgusting. It was downright bizarre. There were 3 full backpacks, big ones like the kind you take on week-long hiking trips. My first thought was that someone had left them behind, maybe campers who had gotten lost or something. But what I found inside was strange. 2 of the bags were packed with high-quality gear, tents, sleeping bags, cooking equipment. Nothing that really stood out. But the 3rd bag was something else entirely. I unzipped it and found it packed to the brim with Skittles. Not just one flavor, but all kinds: regular, tropical, sour, small bags, big bags. It was like someone had decided to haul a lifetime supply of Skittles into the forest and leave it behind. It didn't make sense. Who would do something like that? And why? We spent 4 days in the area, but we never saw anyone else. The bags were still there when we left, untouched. I don't know what the deal was with those Skittles, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. And then there was the time I went backpacking with my dog. It was a spur-of-the-moment overnight trip. I hadn't planned on it, but I decided to get out and spend some time in the woods, away from everything. It wasn't far from the road, just a short hike. I had a small tarp set up for shelter, and a tiny fire crackling nearby. I wasn't trying to hide, but I wasn't being obvious either. I was just enjoying the solitude when I heard the sound of a truck. First, I thought it was nothing, maybe just some locals passing through. But then I heard the voices, drunken and loud. I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying, but it was enough to make me nervous. I didn't like the sound of it, but I tried to ignore it. That is, until I heard the unmistakable sound of gunshots. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. They were shooting in my direction. I wasn't exactly sure how close they were, but the way the land was laid out, it was easy to tell they could see me if they were looking. I could hear them yelling and laughing, but I couldn't make out any specific words. My dog, who had been quietly sitting by the fire, suddenly started to growl. His ears perked up. That was all I needed to hear. I grabbed him and pulled him close, putting him on a tight leash. Couldn't stay there. I didn't want to risk confrontation with a bunch of drunk idiots with guns. I packed up everything as quickly as I could and left, moving quietly through the trees. My mind raced as I retraced my steps back toward the road, trying to make myself as invisible as possible. The last thing I wanted was to run into those guys. I didn't even bother with my fire. I left it burning behind me, hoping it would die out on its own. I didn't feel safe again until I got back to the truck. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I couldn't get the sound of those gunshots out of my head. What if I had stayed a little longer? What if they had seen me? I don't know what they would have done, but I wasn't willing to find out. Camping used to be something I loved, but after those experiences, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe the woods weren't as peaceful as I once thought. The isolation, the strange occurrences, and the moments where I felt watched, they all added up to something unsettling. The woods can be beautiful, but they can also be dangerous, especially when you're not alone. I don't go camping alone anymore. Not after what happened that week in the fall when I thought it would be a good idea to go off-grid for a few days in the Colorado backcountry. I'd done it a few times before, always taking a pack, a tent, enough gear to last about 5 days, and I'd camp miles away from other people. I liked the isolation, the quiet, no cell service, just cold air, wind through trees, and enough space to feel like I wasn't boxed into my regular life. I took a week off work, packed up my gear the night before, and left early that morning. My plan was to hike about 10 miles from the trailhead up into the national forest, set up camp near a creek I'd marked on a topo map, and just sit with my thoughts for a few days. Maybe fish, maybe not. I didn't really care. I just needed the break. The drive up to the trailhead was nothing out of the ordinary. 2-lane roads, pine trees, hills with wide valleys, and the higher I went, the colder it got. When I parked at the trailhead, the temperature was around 40 degrees. I tightened up my boots, strapped on my pack, and headed out. It took me most of the day to reach the spot I had in mind. The trail was steep in some places, but I'd done harder. The sun had dropped behind the trees by the time I set up my tent. I cooked some dehydrated chili on my little camp stove, ate quietly, and rolled into my sleeping bag. I fell asleep to the sound of running water and wind pushing through the trees. The first 2 days were quiet. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything unusual. I walked around the area, followed the creek upstream, watched some squirrels chase each other through the brush. I was maybe 20 feet from a small pool in the creek when I saw it the first time. A mountain lion. It was on the other side of the water, crouched low between 2 logs, drinking. Its fur blended in with the brush behind it so well that I didn't see it at first. When it moved, though, when it turned its head and I saw its face, it gave me this strange mix of fear and awe. It looked like a giant house cat, just way more powerful. Smooth tan coat, thick tail twitching slightly. It looked up, and for a split second, its face shifted into something I didn't expect. It made that dumb cat face, the one you see when a house cat is pooping. I didn't even know big cats did that, but there it was. Eyes squinting slightly, mouth hanging open in that weird grimace. It took me a second to process what I was seeing. The mountain lion was squatting in the grass. It wasn't just drinking, it was taking a crap. Right there in front of me, and just like that, I laughed under my breath. It was such a dumb, harmless thing to see that it cut through my nerves. I backed away slowly, careful not to make noise. I didn't want it to see me. Back at camp, I tried to shake it off, but it stuck in my mind. I'd never seen a mountain lion in the wild before. I knew they were around. I knew they watched people more than people ever saw them. But seeing one that close, even from across the creek, reminded me that I wasn't at the top of the food chain out here. That night, I didn't sleep as easily. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of something outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just light crunching in the leaves and pine needles. Soft footsteps. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The steps stopped and started again. Closer this time. I didn't move. I reached slowly over to where I had my flashlight and knife near my sleeping bag. The flashlight was cold in my hand, and I kept my finger off the button. I didn't want to shine it unless I had to. The noise went quiet. I sat up slowly and waited. Nothing. Not for 10 minutes. Then a sharp snap of a branch. I flicked the light on and pointed it at the tent wall. All I saw was the silver glare of nylon and my own shadow. I held the light still for a few more seconds, then turned it off. Whatever it was, it had moved off. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, probably nothing. The next morning, I walked around the perimeter of my camp. About 30 feet from my tent, I found paw prints in the soft dirt. They were fresh. Mountain lion. I stood there a long time, staring at the tracks. My stomach sank a little. They circled the edge of my campsite, then disappeared into the trees. It had walked around me while I slept. I thought about leaving that day. I should have, but I didn't. I told myself it was moving on, that it wouldn't come back. I made breakfast, cleaned up, and hiked a few miles up the ridge just to kill time. I didn't see or hear anything else that day, but the next night it came back. Around the same time, 2 or 3 in the morning, I heard the same crunching steps. They were closer this time, slower. I sat up and held my flashlight again, but didn't turn it on right away. I was hoping maybe it would move off on its own. Then I heard breathing, right outside the tent. That was when something inside me flipped. I hit the light and aimed it toward the sound. The flashlight beam cut through the tent wall and showed the silhouette of something low and large. I couldn't see it directly, but the outline was clear enough. It stayed there for about 10 seconds, then moved off. I waited until I couldn't hear anything else, then unzipped the tent and stepped out. My legs felt numb. The air was freezing. I swept the light slowly around the trees. Nothing. I found fresh prints again the next morning. This time, they led from the edge of the camp right up to my tent door. I packed up my gear in a hurry. My hands were shaking. I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. I started down the trail the way I came, but after about 2 miles, I stopped. Something didn't feel right. I stood there on the trail listening. I didn't hear anything. No wind, no birds, no squirrels, nothing. I turned around and looked back. There it was, about 50 yards behind me. It was just standing there on the trail. Head low, tail still, ears pointed forward. Watching me. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a second. We stood like that for what felt like forever. Then it started walking toward me. Slow, calm steps. Not crouched, not running. Just walking. I didn't run. I'd read too much about how running can trigger them to chase. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on it. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the can of bear spray. My thumb found the trigger. The mountain lion kept coming. 20 yards, 15, 10. I shouted, loud, tried to make myself big, waved my arms. It stopped, just froze there, tail twitching slightly. Then it lowered itself halfway to the ground, like it was deciding what to do. I popped the safety off the bear spray. My hand was sweating so bad I almost dropped it. Took one more step. That was it. I sprayed. A long, hissing cloud of red mist shot out. It filled the space between us, drifted through the air. The cat didn't charge. It didn't run either. It just backed up slowly, circled off the trail, and disappeared into the trees. I didn't stop walking after that. I made it the rest of the way back to the trailhead in maybe half the time it had taken me to get in. I drove straight home, didn't stop for gas, didn't eat. When I got back, I checked my boots, my bag, everything for damage or missing gear. Then I sat down and thought about everything, over and over again. That dumb cat face, the footsteps, the breathing outside the tent, the way it stared at me like it wasn't sure whether to finish what it started. I read more about mountain lions after that. Turns out they'll stalk people sometimes. Follow them quietly. Watch for a weakness. They rarely attack, but when they do, it's fast. From behind. Usually fatal. Looking back, I don't think it ever planned to kill me. I think it was curious. Testing boundaries. Maybe it thought I was weak or alone or just too far from help to be a risk. But I also think that if I had stayed one more night or made one wrong move on the trail, it might have been different. That look on its face when I saw it squatting. It stuck with me. That one human-like expression in an animal that could have ended me without effort. I laughed at the time, but now it feels like it was the start of a warning. A moment that broke the tension before it all got real. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. It happened about 25 years ago, but I can still remember the trip like it happened last week. I was probably in my early 20s then, maybe 21 or 22. My dad had planned a small camping trip for the four of us, me, him, my younger brother, and a close family friend named Rob. It was the kind of simple trip we used to take once or twice a year when we all had the time, before life got more complicated. We weren't going too far off, just out to a spot in Cowlitz County, Washington, a forested area we'd been to a few times, tucked a bit deeper in than most people go. No marked sites, no bathrooms, just wilderness, and that's the way we liked it. The drive-in was about 2 hours from where we lived, and once we left the main road, we had to crawl along an old Forest Service road full of potholes and loose rock. It was the kind of road where one side falls off into a gully and the other side climbs up a steep slope. Most of the way was under heavy tree cover. No cell service out there, but that wasn't something we worried about in those days. We were used to it. We pulled in sometime mid-afternoon. The light was already starting to slant a little, the way it does when the sun begins to dip behind the trees. The area we picked was a little clearing off the main trail, maybe a couple 100 feet in, ringed by tall firs and underbrush that came up almost to your chest in some places. You could just barely make out the outlines of an old game trail heading off to the west side. There was a fire ring made from stones someone had left behind before, and a patch of dirt big enough to pitch 2 small tents. We set up camp without much talking. Everyone just kind of fell into their usual routines. My dad started collecting wood. My brother cleared out the spot for the fire. Rob and I got the tents up. We didn't bring a ton of gear. We didn't need to. Just a cooler, some sleeping bags, the basics. The plan was to be out for 2 nights, maybe 3 if the weather held up. We weren't far from a stream either, so we had water. After we got things settled, we sat around and cooked some food over the fire. Nothing fancy, just hot dogs and beans, and stayed up talking for a while. Normal stuff, nothing out of the ordinary. It wasn't until sometime after the sun had fully gone down that things started to feel different. Not all at once, just slowly. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it got. Usually out there, even at night, you'll hear something, crickets, frogs, maybe an owl. But that night it was dead still. I didn't say anything about it. No one did, but we all sort of got quieter too. The fire was the only thing really making noise, popping and hissing while we poked at it with sticks. We didn't play music or talk loud. It just didn't feel right. At some point, I got up to take a leak near the edge of the tree line. I brought my flashlight with me, just a small one. It wasn't too far, maybe 15 or 20 feet from camp. I was looking around with the light, just sort of habitually sweeping it side to side, when it caught something. 2 eyes reflecting back at me from the woods. Red, like the way an animal's eyes shine when you hit them just right. But these were higher up than I expected. Not way up in the trees or anything, but higher than eye level. Too high for a deer, too far apart for a raccoon or a fox. I stood there for a few seconds, thinking maybe it was an owl on a branch or something, but the eyes didn't move. They just stared. I didn't say anything right away. I just turned back toward the fire and kept it to myself. Maybe I didn't want to freak anyone out. Maybe I didn't want to admit it gave me a weird feeling. When I sat back down, I kept my flashlight close. A few minutes later, Rob got up to grab another beer from the cooler, and I saw him stop and look toward the trees too. I don't think he saw the same thing, but he hesitated for a second before coming back over. That's when I started to feel it wasn't just me. After a while, we started to hear the sounds. First, it was a soft crack, like a branch breaking underfoot. Not far off to the west of us, just beyond the firelight. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't constant. Every few minutes, a crunch, a shuffle, the sound of brush moving. Not enough to say for sure something was there, but just enough to keep us looking into the dark. Then, out of nowhere, a small rock bounced into the fire pit. It made a little pop when it hit the edge of the coals. We all looked up at the same time. My brother kind of laughed nervously and said something like, "Wind must have knocked it loose." But we all knew it didn't come from above, came from the woods. Another one came maybe 5 or 10 minutes later. Same thing. Not hard, not big, but definitely thrown. It bounced and rolled across the dirt and landed near the edge of the fire. We didn't say much, just stared off in the direction it came from. After that, it was a stick, then another rock. Never anything big, never directly at us. Always near the fire, just enough to be noticed, enough to be weird. It went on like that for a while, maybe an hour, maybe more. Time kind of stretches when you're watching shadows. But eventually it stopped. The woods stayed quiet. No more noises. No more thrown things. It got late, and one by one we turned in. My dad and I were sharing a tent, and the other two were in theirs just a few feet away. We weren't far from the fire. It had burned down to a low glow by then, just embers and a couple half-burned logs. The air had that cold snap to it, the kind that creeps in from under the sleeping bag and settles into your spine. I dozed off, but I'm a light sleeper. Always have been. Sometime around 5 in the morning, I woke up. It wasn't a noise exactly. It was more of a feeling. Something wasn't right. My eyes opened and I just laid there listening. A few seconds later, I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Slow. Not like a deer crashing through the brush, and not like a squirrel darting around. These were steady, deliberate steps moving just outside the tent, maybe 10 or 15 feet away. The ground was still damp from a bit of rain the night before, so you could hear the soft squish of boots or bare feet pressing into it. Then came the smell. That's what really set me off. It wasn't just the musty smell of the woods or the usual campfire stink. It was something worse, something foul, like old garbage left in the sun. Rotting meat, musk, a mix of sweat, soil, and something sour. It hit like a wall. My dad was already awake too. I could tell by the way his breathing changed. Neither of us said anything. We just listened. The steps stopped right behind our tent. I could hear something breathing. Slow, heavy breaths. Not human. Not quite animal either. Something big. Then my dad snapped. He sat up quick and slammed his hand against the side of the tent. Hard. Didn't say anything clever or subtle. Just barked loud and angry and sudden, and whatever it was bolted. I could hear it running. Branches snapping, leaves crunching, and then silence. We didn't sleep after that. We just lay there, wide-eyed and wired, waiting for the sun to come up. When it finally did, we got out and looked around. Nothing obvious was disturbed. The fire had burned out. The coolers were untouched. No tracks we could find, but the ground was a mess of fallen needles and twigs anyway. If something had been there, it didn't leave much. But the smell was still faintly there, in the air, clinging to the edge of the tent and the side of the tree it had stood by. My dad noticed it too. He didn't say anything about it, just started packing up. We didn't stay the extra night. We left by mid-morning. Took our time hiking out, didn't speak much. We kept looking behind us though. The woods felt different in the daylight, but not completely. Still too quiet, like whatever had been there was still watching. I've camped 100 times since then, maybe more. Been out in worse weather, deeper woods, further from help. But nothing ever felt like that trip. I don't know what it was out there. I don't care to guess. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was something real. Flesh and blood, maybe someone, maybe something, but it watched us, threw things at us, walked into our camp while we slept, and it didn't care that we were 4 grown men with a fire and flashlights. Whatever it was, it left when my dad confronted it. That much is clear. It didn't want to fight, but it came close, too close, and I've never forgotten the way those eyes looked in the flashlight beam. Too high up, too still. That stink. the breathing, the way it waited until we were asleep. Some things in the woods don't need to be explained. They just need to be remembered and respected. And I remember. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so camping was something I was always used to. My friends and I started doing solo camping trips together when we were in high school, and as we got older, it became our way of reconnecting. Every summer, no matter where we lived or worked, we picked a weekend, met at a trailhead somewhere in Washington, and headed out into the woods with our gear. We always kept it simple: tents, propane stoves, some beers, dried food, fishing gear, and plenty of firewood. That was enough. This trip was like most others at first. We had picked a spot about 2 hours outside of Seattle, near a smaller lake we'd found on an old Forest Service map. Nothing too deep in the wilderness, but far enough from cell service that you had to be comfortable without it. It wasn't a marked campground, just a pull-off that someone had used before, judging by the old fire ring and a few beer cans that had been half buried in the dirt. I got there first, sometime in the early afternoon, and set up my tent while I waited for the others. There were 3 of us total: me, Luke, and Ryan. We'd all done this trip many times before and had a decent system down. Ryan brought his big cooler and camp stove, Luke usually handled firewood and water, and I brought all the extras: tools, tarps, lanterns, and so on. That first day, we just got things set up. Nothing out of the ordinary. The weather was nice, a little cloudy but warm, no sign of rain. It was one of those quiet forested spots, all pines and ferns, with thick needles on the ground and hardly any sound except for birds. You could hear a creek about 150 yards downhill from where we set up the tents, and the trail leading down to the lake curved around a ridge behind us. That first night was uneventful. We had dinner around the fire, drank a couple of beers, and turned in when it got too dark to see much. No cell phones, no music, just the fire crackling and some wind through the trees. We all slept fine. The second day was when things got weird. It started in the morning. I was the first one up, as usual. I stepped out of the tent and noticed a few small pine cones scattered on top of Luke's car. At first, I didn't think anything of it. It was a pine forest, after all. That kind of stuff just happens. But I remember looking up and thinking that the trees above us didn't look like the kind that dropped cones that easily. They weren't heavy with cones, and the wind wasn't strong. I brushed it off and got water going for coffee. Luke and Ryan came out of their tents a little later, and we sat around like we always did, sipping coffee, warming up in the morning sun. It was peaceful. No one mentioned the cones. We spent most of that day hiking down to the lake and fishing for a while. It was slow, but we caught a few trout, enough to eat. Around mid-afternoon, we started heading back up the ridge toward camp. That's when I noticed more pine cones. Not just on the car now, on the tent roofs, on the cooler, scattered around the fire ring. More than you'd expect. Enough that it looked like someone had maybe dumped a bucket of them over our site. And again, no wind. That night, we cooked the fish and settled in again. We joked about raccoons or maybe a bear in the area, but our food was stored properly and nothing had been touched. Still, I got this strange feeling in my chest, like something was just a little off. I didn't mention it. We'd been camping long enough to know how to handle wildlife. A few pine cones weren't enough to make a big deal out of. Around midnight, I woke up to a loud sound. A thud. Something had hit the roof of my tent. Not lightly either. It bounced off the nylon and rolled down one of the walls. I waited, heart racing a little, thinking maybe it was just a branch falling. But then came another, and another. Small thuds, irregular, but loud enough to notice. It wasn't wind, there was no wind that night. I lay there still, just listening. A few minutes passed and it stopped. The next morning, I walked around the camp and found sticks this time. Not just twigs, but medium-sized broken branches, clearly snapped and thrown. One was laying on the hood of Ryan's car. Another had landed on the picnic bench next to the fire ring. A few more were scattered near the tents. None of us really said anything about it, not directly. Luke made some comment about squirrels or chipmunks, but you could tell he didn't buy it either. It didn't feel right. Small animals don't throw things that size, and they definitely don't do it in the middle of the night, one piece at a time. We kept going with the trip like usual. We cooked, cleaned up, sat around the fire. But each night, the noise came back. It was different every time. One night, it was pine cones again, dozens of them, hitting the tent walls and the cars. Another night, it was stones, smaller ones, about the size of a bottle cap. You'd hear them hit the tents, skip off the tarps, or bounce off the coolers. But never all at once. Always one or two at a time, like someone was watching and deliberately tossing them down. Not an avalanche of stuff, not a tree shedding its load. Just individual, targeted hits. That's what started to bother me. I tried staying up one night, waiting to see where it was coming from. I sat out by the fire with a flashlight and a headlamp, just listening. But nothing happened. No noises, no movement, just silence. I waited until about 3 a.m., then gave up and went back to bed. Within 20 minutes, I heard it again. 2 thuds. Something hit Ryan's tent that time. I got up and went out with the flashlight, scanned the trees, the ridge, the surrounding brush. Nothing. Not a single thing moved. By the 4th day, I was tired. We all were. None of us were sleeping well. The tension was growing. No one was talking about it, but I could feel it. Ryan was quieter. Luke kept glancing up into the trees, scanning the canopy. We all were on edge. That afternoon, we were sitting at the camp when a pine cone came sailing down directly onto the roof of the cooler. Hard, not dropped, thrown. It hit with a smack, bounced, and rolled off. It was enough to make me jump. Ryan stood up and started scanning the trees immediately. Luke followed. I didn't say a word. We stood there in silence for almost a minute. That was the first time I really understood that it wasn't an accident. We weren't alone. Now, this wasn't a bear. It wasn't raccoons. Bears don't throw things like that, not in that pattern, not with that kind of accuracy. This wasn't wildlife in the usual sense. That night was the worst. I barely slept. Around 2 in the morning, something hit my tent hard, like someone slapped it. Not a pine cone, not a stick. A full palm-sized hit. I sat bolt upright, turned on my light, and froze. I could hear something moving in the brush. Slow, not trying to be quiet, just walking. I didn't call out. I didn't even move. I just sat there, holding my breath. It circled my tent once, crunching on dry needles, then moved toward the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told the others I wanted to cut the trip short. I made up some excuse about a bad headache, but they agreed too quickly. We were all done. Something about that place didn't feel right anymore. When we packed up, we noticed the last weird thing. On the side of Luke's car, just above the back wheel, were scratches. Deep ones, not random. 3 lines close together, almost straight, like from fingers or claws, but not an animal's. Too deliberate. Luke saw them and went quiet. We didn't talk about it. We just finished loading the cars and got the hell out of there. I didn't relax until we were back on the main road, cell service back on, the trees thinning out behind us. I didn't say anything to the others for a few days. Neither of them brought it up either. A week later, Luke sent a photo of the scratches on his car. He'd taken it when he got home. He said he couldn't figure out what caused them. Too deep for branches. Too narrow for any known animal. No prints. No smudges. Just those 3 marks. To this day, I don't know what it was. Maybe it really was a squirrel pissed off that we were in its territory. But I've camped for over 20 years in places much deeper than that, and I've never experienced anything like it. The pattern, the noise, the slow build-up, it didn't feel like an animal acting randomly. It felt like something warning us off, and it worked. I've never gone back to that area, and I don't plan to. I don't care how remote it is. I'll take a busy campground over that place any day. I was 34 when I decided to spend a week alone in the woods, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. Back then, I'd gone with friends. This time was different. I wanted quiet, space to think, and to get away from work, noise, and people. It was early October, and the temperatures had just started dropping. Not freezing yet, but the air had that sharp edge in the mornings and evenings that reminded you winter wasn't far off. I drove up to a remote area in northern Pennsylvania, about 4 hours from where I lived. The place wasn't a formal campground. It was state forest land, and as long as you didn't damage anything or stay too close to trails, it was legal to camp there. That's what I wanted, no assigned spots, no other campers within shouting distance. Just the woods, the cold, and me. I brought everything I needed. A 4-season tent, a good sleeping bag, propane stove, a solid supply of food, a water filter, maps, and backup batteries for everything. I packed carefully. I even had a satellite messenger device in case something went really wrong. I was cautious, not paranoid, just cautious. I parked my truck at the end of a fire road, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started hiking. The spot I had picked on the map was about 5 miles in. There was a slight rise there, a flat area between 2 ridges, with a stream running close by. It took me a little over 2 hours to get there, with a few stops to rest. The trail was faint, really just a game trail most of the way. I didn't see another human being once I left the truck. When I got to the spot, I felt good about it. The ground was dry. The stream was running clear. I had shelter from the wind thanks to the ridges and some thicker trees. I pitched my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, set up a small cooking area away from the tent, and gathered firewood just in case I wanted a fire at night. The first day was peaceful. I heated a can of chili, made some tea, and sat on a log watching the trees move with the wind. It got dark early. I crawled into my sleeping bag not long after sunset. I had brought a book, but I only made it through a few pages before I felt sleepy. I woke up once in the night to pee and saw a few deer moving silently through the trees. Their eyes reflected the light from my headlamp like marbles. That kind of thing doesn't scare me. I've spent enough time in the woods to know the sounds, the animals. It's just part of being out there. Still, I kept the headlamp on while I stood near the edge of camp. I didn't like being totally blind. The next day, I hiked farther out with a lighter day pack. I wanted to explore. I didn't follow a path, just aimed myself toward a ridge I saw on the map. The woods got denser, quieter. I found animal tracks, deer mostly, a few small black bear tracks too. I didn't worry. I made sure I carried a whistle and my bear spray, and I was careful about where I stepped. Around mid-afternoon, I turned back toward camp. I hadn't seen anything unusual, but I kept looking over my shoulder. That's something that happens sometimes when you're alone in the woods. Your senses stretch further than normal. Every little crack of a twig sounds sharper. Every rustle makes your head turn. But it wasn't fear exactly, just awareness. When I got back to camp, something was different. Nothing was destroyed. My tent was still there, food bag untouched. But I noticed a pile of small stones near the edge of camp that hadn't been there before. Not in a neat stack, just a rough little mound about the size of a basketball. Caught my eye right away. I hadn't seen any stones like that around the area. These were smoother, rounded, like the kind you find near rivers, not like the jagged stuff on the ridges. I looked around more carefully, checked to see if anyone had been through, but there were no footprints. I'm not a tracker, but the ground was soft enough that I think I would have seen something if someone had walked through. I touched the rocks. They were cold, slightly damp. I left them alone. Maybe I had just missed them before. I told myself. That night I made a fire. Not a big one, just enough to warm up by. I didn't like how quiet the woods had gotten. There weren't any animal sounds anymore. No owls. No movement in the underbrush. It wasn't completely silent, but it felt heavier somehow, like the forest was holding its breath. I stayed up late. Too late, probably. Kept the fire going longer than I needed to. When I finally put it out, I zipped myself into the tent and lay there for a long time, not reading, just listening. Around midnight, I heard something. It wasn't close, but it was clear. A crunch, a pause, another crunch, like someone or something walking slowly through dry leaves. I didn't move, just lay there and listened. The steps were spaced out. Not a deer. Deer move quickly unless they're grazing. These steps were deliberate. They faded after a while. I couldn't tell which direction they went, but I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I checked around the camp. No footprints again. No broken branches, no obvious signs of anything. The pile of rocks was still there, but slightly different now. A stick had been driven into the middle of it. Not broken off, just stuck vertically like a marker. I stared at it for a long time. I thought about leaving, packing up and hiking out, but I felt stubborn. This was public land. I planned for a week. I wasn't going to let my imagination push me out. I wasn't hurt. Nothing was stolen or damaged, so I stayed. I kept going through the routines, filtering water, cooking food, hiking, checking my gear. But I was more alert now, always scanning the trees, listening harder than I should have needed to. That night, I didn't light a fire. I wanted to listen, not draw attention. And I did hear something again, just after midnight. This time it was different. It was breathing, not mine, not an animal. It was steady, low, like someone trying not to breathe too loud but failing. I couldn't tell how far away it was. Could have been 30 feet, could have been 10. I held still, holding my own breath, just listening. The breathing stopped. Then something bumped into the side of the tent. Not hard, just enough to make the fabric ripple. A single, slow drag across the nylon wall like a hand or stick. I sat up slowly and grabbed my knife. I didn't say anything, didn't make a sound. Just sat there with the blade in my hand and waited. It didn't happen again. I stayed like that until the sky started turning gray. When the sun finally came up, I got out fast, circled the tent. Nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing obvious. The stick in the rock pile was gone now. The rocks were spread out like someone had kicked them away. I knew then I had to leave. This wasn't just in my head. Something or someone was out there, watching me, maybe trying to mess with me, or worse. I packed up everything. Took longer than it should have because I kept stopping to look around. Every squirrel that moved in the brush made me freeze. I had the bear spray clipped to my chest, the knife in my belt, and the emergency beacon in my pocket. As I started hiking back toward the truck, I noticed something else. About 20 minutes from camp, I came across a dead rabbit, laid out across the middle of the trail. His throat had been cut, not torn, cut. A clean line across the neck like a knife or blade had done it. There was no blood around it, just the rabbit, stiff and cold, laid out on its side with its legs straight. I didn't touch it, just stepped around and kept going. My heart was hammering by then, and my mouth felt dry. I kept my eyes on the trees, scanned every shadow. Every time the wind moved a branch, I flinched. The last mile to the truck was the worst. The woods felt tighter there, the trees closer together. I kept expecting to see someone step out onto the trail. I walked fast, didn't stop for anything. When I reached the truck, everything looked the same. No damage, no sign anyone had been there. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the bed without tying it down, and got inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't relax until I'd made it off the fire road and onto the main road again. I didn't stop driving for hours, not until I got to a small gas station about 60 miles away. I got out, used the bathroom, bought a bottle of water, and sat in the truck with the engine running. I didn't report anything. Who would I tell? That someone stacked rocks and put a stick in them? That I heard breathing and found a dead rabbit? None of it was technically illegal or provable. But I knew what I'd experienced wasn't right. Someone was out there, not a hiker, not a hunter. Someone who knew the woods and knew how to scare without being seen. They didn't steal anything. They didn't attack me, but they wanted me gone, and they made sure I understood that. It worked. I haven't been camping alone since, and I won't again.